The water hit her in the middle of a sentence. My wife didn't just insult my elderly mother at a high society corporate gala. She intentionally snapped my father's final keepsake and threw in a fountain, declaring we didn't belong around real wealth. What my wife and 200 powerful executives didn't realize was that I wasn't just an underpaid contractor. I was a silent owner of the multi-billion-dollar company they were standing in. Make sure to watch until the very end, because the look on her face when the truth came out was unforgettable. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let me know which city or country you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing where our community tunes in from every week. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength and real justice, please hit that like button and subscribe to stay connected. The grand atrium of the historic Marble Merchants Bank was designed in 1928 to make ordinary human beings feel small. Soaring vaulted ceilings, polished marble floors that reflected the crystal chandeliers like quiet water, and 200 of the region's most powerful investors sipping champagne under gilded arches. It was a 25th anniversary gala for Aegis Infrastructure Group, a multi-billion-dollar engineering titan, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and unearned confidence. Standing near the center of that vast room was Clara Vance. She wore a neatly pressed, handmade navy dress she had tailored herself 20 years ago in a small rural town. She didn't have diamonds around her neck or a designer label stitched into her collar, but she stood with the effortless grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime doing honest work. Beside her was her son, Arthur Vance, wearing an 11-year-old tweed jacket and carrying himself with the quiet, unassuming composure of a man who never felt the need to prove his worth to a room full of strangers. To the executive sipping scotch near the mezzanine, Arthur was merely a lower-tier technical consultant, a quiet, behind-the-scenes engineer who occasionally drafted stress distribution models and kept to himself. But his wife, Evelyn Vance, viewed him through a much harsher lens. Evelyn was a vice president of corporate communications, a woman who had spent her entire career treating human relationships like public relations campaigns. To Evelyn, image was everything, and the sight of her husband standing in the center of Aegis's grandest night alongside his frumpy, small-town mother was an unbearable embarrassment. Evelyn cut through the crowd like a knife. Her silk gown whispered against the marble as she cornered Clara near a massive, 5-foot floral installation. Her smile was sharp, calculated, and entirely void of warmth. She pitched her voice just low enough for the surrounding circle of board members and high-net-worth investors to hear, ensuring every word landed with deliberate impact. She asked Clara what brought her to an event like this, her tone dripping with condescending pity, hinting that a woman of her background must feel completely out of place surrounded by real high society. Clara didn't flinch. She simply smiled with quiet maternal dignity, resting her weathered hand on the small, vintage brass pocket watch hanging from her belt, a cherished heirloom given to her by Arthur's late father before he passed away in a rail yard accident decades ago. Then came the strike. In a swift, calculated movement disguised as an awkward stumble, Evelyn reached out, her sharp acrylic nail catching the delicate brass chain of the pocket watch. With a deliberate, forceful jerk, she snapped the antique mounting. The sound of tearing metal echoed softly against the stone, and the heirloom flew from Clara's hands, arcing through the air before crashing with a loud splash into the tiered stone fountain behind them. The room went dead silent. Evelyn didn't apologize. Instead, she took a step back, dabbed an imaginary drop of water on her sleeve, and spoke loudly enough for 30 people to hear. She told Clara that some things simply don't belong near real elegance, and that bringing cheap relics into a room built on billions was a mistake Arthur should have known better than to make. Arthur didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam a fist on a table or make a scene. He stepped forward, walked straight into the cold water of the fountain, and reached down to retrieve his father's shattered watch. He dried the wet metal against his sleeve, placed it gently into his mother's trembling palm, and wrapped his arm securely around her shoulders. Then he turned to face his wife. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was a cold, unshakable certainty of a man who had reached his absolute limit. He looked Evelyn dead in the eye and said quietly, "You spent years looking at the surface, Evelyn, and judging people by what they wear. You're about to learn what holds is building up." To understand the unshakable calm Arthur Vance carried into that grand atrium, you have to go back to a drafty 2-story house on the edge of a dying timber town in western Pennsylvania. Nothing about Arthur's life made sense without understanding the house, where he learned to listen to the structural load of a floorboard before stepping on it. His father died when Arthur was 9 years old. A freight coupling snapped on a freezing November morning at the local rail yard. Quick, cold, and entirely without warning. He left behind 3 months of medical bills from an earlier back injury, an iron anvil resting in the corner of a gravel shed, and a widow who refocused her grief into absolute, tireless motion. Clara Vance did not allow herself the luxury of breaking down. By 6 every morning, she was behind the counter at the local village post office, sorting heavy canvas mail bags and stamping money order for loggers. By 7 every evening, she was down in the damp, stone-walled basement of their home, working under the yellow light of a bare 70-watt bulb. She spent her nights restoring antique oak and walnut furniture, sanding down decades of chipped varnish, hand-dovetail joining split drawers, and rubbing raw linseed oil into dried wood until her fingers bled into the rags. Every dollar she earned from those restored heirlooms went directly into a rusted metal tin hidden inside her sewing machine cabinet, earmarked for one thing: Arthur's education. Arthur grew up to the steady, rhythmic scrape of sandpaper against hardwood. He studied civil engineering by the light of that same basement bulb, watching his mother turn discarded, forgotten things into pieces of art that could endure another century of heavy use. When he entered graduate school on a partial academic grant, it was those rusty tins of cash that paid for his advanced structural design textbooks, books that cost more than a logger's weekly wage. The turning point came during the spring of his master's program. Arthur had developed a groundbreaking mathematical model, a revolutionary stress distribution algorithm that could calculate dynamic load failures in massive civil infrastructure years before a single crack appeared in the concrete. It was an invention that could redefine modern bridge and port construction, but securing the patent protection, legal registration, and foundational filing fees required tens of thousands of dollars he simply did not have. He came home one Friday evening, exhausted and ready to abandon the project to take a low-level regional drafting job. Clara listened quietly as he sat at the kitchen table, his head buried in his hands. She stood up, walked down into the damp basement, and returned carrying a thick, grease-stained manila envelope. She set it on the table between them. Inside was $42,000 in cash, the sum total of her entire life savings, earned over 15 years of midnight sanding in double shifts. Every heirloom she had saved was gone. She had sold her final prized oak dining set that very afternoon. She looked her son in the eye and said 4 words that became the bedrock of his life. Build something that doesn't bend when the wind blows, Arthur. He took that money, registered the patent, and used that very algorithm as a foundational pillar upon which Aegis Infrastructure Group was built. But when early predatory lawsuits from aggressive corporate competitors threatened to drag his quiet mother into public depositions, Arthur took a step that shocked his inner circle. He created a private blind structure called the Vance Heritage Trust, placing 65% of Aegis's ultimate controlling equity inside it. He placed his trusted childhood friend, David Van Sterling, as the public-facing chief executive officer, while Arthur deliberately stepped into the shadowed title of senior technical consultant. To the world, he was an ordinary engineer earning an ordinary wage. To the foundation of the company, he was the sole pillar holding the entire roof above their heads. Over the next 15 years, Aegis Infrastructure Group expanded from a 2-room office above a diner into a $4 billion engineering giant. Its footprint was carved directly into the bedrock of 10 states, spanning high-capacity suspension bridges, deep waterport terminals, and subterranean transit networks that move millions of citizens every single day. The company was a quiet colossus, and at the heart of every blueprint, every structural stress analysis, and every long-term safety certification sat Arthur Vance's foundational algorithms. Yet, if you drove past the Aegis regional headquarters on any given Tuesday, you would never have picked Arthur out of a crowd of commuting employees. While the executive vice presidents arrived in gleaming luxury sedans and wore tailor-made suits designed to command attention, Arthur drove a fading, 11-year-old station wagon with a slightly squeaky fan belt. He wore the same 3 elbow-patch tweed jackets in rotation, carried a scuffed leather satchel he'd used since graduate school, and spent his weekends painting the porch railings or clearing gutters at his mother's quaint white picket farmhouse on the outskirts of town. He didn't live modestly out of fake humility or secret performance. He lived modestly because he simply had no interest in the theater of wealth. He measured his life by structural integrity, both in steel girders and in his own daily character. 3 years before the night of the gala, Arthur met Evelyn at a company-sponsored charity fundraiser. At the time, Evelyn was a rising star in corporate marketing, obsessed with trajectory, status, and the public appearance of success. When she looked at Arthur, she saw a quiet, predictable, middle management staff engineer. In her eyes, he was safe, low-risk, and comfortably unremarkable, a stable background presence who would never overshadow her own ambitious rise to the corporate ranks. When their relationship progressed toward marriage, Evelyn made a move that showed exactly how she evaluated people. She brought a thick, formal prenuptial agreement to dinner one evening, sliding it across the table alongside a glass of wine. She framed it as a matter of modern executive independence, explaining in a polished, practiced tone that she needed to protect her corporate performance bonuses, stock options, and independent assets from potential liability. She watched his face closely, fully expecting a fight, or at least a wounded blow to his pride from a man she believed made a fraction of her salary. Arthur picked up the document, flipped through its 30 pages, and signed his name on the final page without a single moment of hesitation or argument. What Evelyn read as passive compliance, or perhaps the desperate submissiveness of a man who knew he was marrying above his financial station, was actually a moment of profound, quiet irony. Arthur's legal counsel had reviewed the trust structure years ago. 65% of Aegis, held safely inside the Vance Heritage Trust, predated the relationship by nearly 2 decades. The prenuptial agreement Evelyn had drafted to lock Arthur out of her world actually sealed her entirely out of his. Arthur said nothing. He handed the pen back, smiled softly, and let her keep her illusion. There's a deep, quiet satisfaction in carrying real strength without ever needing to wave a flag to prove it. Evelyn walked into the marriage believing she was a financially dominant partner protecting her hard-earned turf, while Arthur simply folded his copy of the document, put away in a desk drawer, and went back to work making sure the bridges stayed up. The change didn't happen overnight. It crept in like rust on an unpainted beam, slow and invisible until the weight became too heavy to hold. As Evelyn was promoted to vice president of corporate communications, the modest life she and Arthur shared transformed from a minor inconvenience into a personal insult in her eyes. At corporate functions, she learned to maneuver through rooms with practiced surgical skill, ensuring Arthur was always situated several yards away from high-net-worth investors or visiting board members. When an executive did happen to ask about the quiet man standing near the wall in the faded tweed jacket, Evelyn would offer a tight, polished smile and dismiss him in a single breath, introducing him as just a contractor who handles some of our behind-the-scenes technical drafting. At home, behind closed doors, the quiet contempt turned into open hostility. She would stand in their kitchen, her heels clicking angrily against the tile, berating him for his total refusal to upgrade his station wagon, buy designer suits, or apply for a membership at the prestigious Oak Ridge Country Club. She accused him of having no drive, no ambition, and no respect for the image she was trying to build. People judge us by what we display, Arthur, she would snap, setting her designer handbag down with forced authority. And right now, you look like a man who gave up 20 years ago. Arthur rarely argued back. He would listen calmly, wash his dinner plate in the sink, and look at her with a quiet, observant patience that only infuriated her more. But beneath his calm exterior, Arthur was taking notes on the gradual decay of a woman he had once genuinely cared for. He watched her surrender her ethics piece by piece, trading real human connection for the hollow prestige of executive titles and corner offices. What concerned Arthur most was not her sharp tongue, but her growing proximity to Sterling Hayes, Aegis's ruthless chief operating officer. Hayes was a man who viewed corporate infrastructure not as a public service, but as a chest of assets waiting to be stripped and monetized. Arthur began to notice Hayes' name popping up constantly on Evelyn's calendar. Late-night strategy sessions, private dinners at high-end steakhouses, and encrypted messaging channels that vanished after reading. Hayes praised Evelyn's ambition, feeding her vanity with promises of rapid advancement and board-level influence, and Evelyn devoured every word. Arthur gave her multiple quiet opportunities to pull back from the edge. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, 3 months before the gala, He sat her down at the kitchen table and asked her plainly if she was happy with the path she was choosing, reminding her that real worth had nothing to do with executive titles or the price of a car. Evelyn merely laughed, a cold, brittle sound, and told him that speech sounded like something written by a man who knew he could never reach the top. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and left to meet Hayes for another Sunday conference call. In that moment, something shifted inside Arthur. The subtle heartbreak of watching his marriage crumble was replaced by a cold, mathematical clarity. He realized that Evelyn hadn't just grown distant. She had chosen to align herself entirely with a philosophy that measured human beings by surface appearances. He watched her walk out the door, knowing that every choice she was making was slowly painting her into a corner she would never be able to escape. The discovery didn't happen during a dramatic raid or an anonymous leak. It happened on a quiet Tuesday night in Arthur's home study, buried inside 3,000 lines of routine system diagnostic code. Arthur was running an annual stress load verification audit across Aegis's bridge division, a safety protocol he personally wrote 15 years prior, when a mathematical anomaly flagged a routine maintenance ledger. A six-figure allocation for structural steel reinforcement on a high-capacity river bridge had been processed, approved, and marked complete. Yet the physical sensor telemetry on the bridge showed zero new material installed. Arthur began pulling on the thread, tracing the financial routing through a labyrinth of secondary accounts. Within 4 hours of cold, systematic analysis, the full picture emerged. $45 million had been systematically siphoned out Aegis's core maintenance reserves over 18 months. The money was routed through 3 layers of logistics shell companies before settling into an offshore entity named Apex Holdings. This wasn't simple embezzlement. It was a calculated execution scheme. Sterling Hayes was intentionally starving the bridge division of maintenance funding, creating the artificial appearance of ballooning liabilities and operational decay. Hayes's master plan was to force an emergency board vote to liquidate Aegis's most profitable division at a 40% discount, selling it directly to Apex Holdings, a private equity group Hayes secretly controlled. It was a hostile, internal takeover designed to strip Aegis of its foundational assets and hand Hayes absolute private control of a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure engine. Then Arthur hit the compliance documentation page, and his hand froze on the mouse. Sitting directly beneath the official regulatory clearances and public communications releases for Apex Holdings was an encrypted electronic authorization mark. Evelyn Vance, Vice President of Corporate Communications. Evelyn hadn't just signed off on the press releases framing the division as a failing asset. She had personally authorized internal compliance waivers that bypassed standard board oversight. Further down the digital file trail, buried inside an encrypted draft agreement between Hayes and Apex, was a payoff. Upon the final closure of the asset sale, Evelyn was slated to step into a senior managing partner role in the newly privatized firm, complete with a 6% direct equity stake. Arthur went very still. The room was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the desk clock. Evelyn wasn't merely ashamed of his tweed jackets or embarrassed by his quiet lifestyle. She was actively helping Hayes tear down the very company Arthur had built from his mother's kitchen table, fully prepared to leave thousands of workers in jeopardy for a polished title and a seat at Hayes' table. Without shedding a tear or raising his pulse, Arthur encrypted the entire audit file, loaded it onto a secure external drive, and called David Van Sterling on a direct private line. David picked up on the second ring. "David," Arthur said, his voice flat, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "Sterling Hayes is attempting to cut the legs out from under the bridge division," and Evelyn just put her signature on the saw. Over the next 48 hours, Arthur and David quietly built a forensic digital cage around Hayes and Evelyn, gathering unalterable server logs, bank transfer routing numbers, and signed corporate filings. Arthur watched his wife across the dinner table that night as she nonchalantly discussed her upcoming corporate calendar. The quiet grief of final disappointment settled deep into his chest, replaced by the cold, unyielding precision of an engineer who knows exactly which pillar needs to be pulled to bring down a rotten ceiling. By 6 o'clock the morning after the gala, the calculated machine of corporate public relations was already spinning at full speed. Evelyn knew that 20 people had witnessed a snapped pocket watch near the fountain, and she was far too experienced in crisis management to let a rumor gain traction. Her strategy was simple, vicious, and preemptive. convert a cruel public act into a narrative of self-defense. Working directly through Aegis's internal communications network, Evelyn drafted and authorized an official company-wide safety memo. It outlined an alarming incident involving a disgruntled, low-level technical contractor who had repeatedly attempted to breach high-security executive events alongside an unregistered, emotionally erratic relative. To ensure the story took root, she took a 15-second clip from the atrium security cameras, artfully edited to trim out the moment her own hand snapped Clara's brass watch chain, and uploaded it to the internal executive portal. The clipped video began with Clara reaching toward the fountain and ended with Arthur stepping directly into the water, framing the elderly mother as a trespasser causing a public scene and Arthur as an unstable staffer making wild threats against senior leadership. By noon, the smear campaign spilled into Arthur's personal life. When he drove his station wagon back to their luxury downtown condominium to collect his father's tools and a change of clothes, his key car flashed red at the underground security gate. A uniformed guard stepped out, looking at him with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment, and informed him that his access had been revoked by the primary leaseholder. 10 minutes later, a process server approached his driver's side window and handed him a thick stack of legal documents. Evelyn had filed an emergency petition for divorce on the grounds of behavioral instability and irreconcilable financial incompatibility. Attached to the front was a handwritten sticky note from Evelyn herself. The prenuptial agreement you signed holds up completely. You leave with what you brought in, which is absolutely nothing. Don't call me. Simultaneously, the second jaw of the trap snapped shut inside Aegis headquarters. Sterling Hayes made his move before the board could process the gala incident, utilizing a series of fabricated administrative compliance violations, alleging that CEO David Van Sterling had mishandled regional vendor audits. Hayes executed a sudden, emergency administrative motion. Backed by 3 board members he had bought off with promises of future equity in Apex Holdings, Hayes placed David on immediate, forced administrative leave, freezing his executive credentials and locking him out of the main corporate servers. By nightfall, Arthur stood on the sidewalk across from the towering glass facade of Aegis Infrastructure. In less than 12 hours, he had been publicly branded an unstable lunatic, locked out his home, served with divorce papers, and stripped of his closest operational ally inside the company he owned. Every colleague he passed on the street looked away, terrified that being seen with him would end their own careers. To Hayes and Evelyn, Arthur was officially isolated, ruined, and erased, a penniless contractor who had been crushed under the weight of real corporate power. They believed the path to liquidating the bridge division was now wide open, completely blind to the fact that they were pushing a man into the one place where he was truly dangerous. Arthur quietly put the divorce papers in his satchel, got into his station wagon, and drove away from the flashing city lights, heading straight toward the drafty farmhouse in Pennsylvania where the foundation had been built. The gravel drive beneath Arthur's station wagon crunched softly as he pulled into the yard of the old Pennsylvania farmhouse. The night air was cool, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth, completely untouched by the noise of the city he had left behind. Inside, the warm glow of a single lamp illuminated the kitchen window. When Arthur opened the door, Clara was sitting at the table, a hot pot of black tea resting on a braided trivet between 2 cups. Her navy dress from the night before was neatly folded on a nearby chair, and in its place she wore her familiar canvas work apron. She didn't look like a woman who had spent the last 24 hours featured in an executive smear campaign. She looked as steady and unbothered as the stone foundation beneath her feet. "I put the kettle on an hour ago," she said quietly, sliding a cup across the pine table. "I knew you'd be driving late." Before Arthur could answer, headlights swept across the kitchen wall. 2 black SUVs hired by Hayes' media management team pulled up to the wooden front gate. 3 aggressive tabloid reporters and 2 hired agitators stepped out into the night, wielding flashlights and megaphones, preparing to shout questions about Arthur's supposed mental breakdown and Clara's trespassing at the gala. Arthur moved toward the window, but Clara didn't even turn her head. She simply took a sip of her tea. Outside, before the agitators could even step off the gravel shoulder, 2 unmarked black sedans parked down the lane flicked on their high beams. 4 tall men in dark suits, members of elite, private security firm funded quietly through the Vance Heritage Trust for over 15 years, stepped into the glare. Within 30 seconds, without a single loud word or raised fist, the security detail blocked the reporters' cameras, handed them formal civil trespass notices backed by state police authority, and escorted the vehicles out of the county. The farm returned to dead silence. Clara set her teacup down, stood up, and walked out to the attached wood shop in the back. Arthur followed her past the rows of hand planes, iron clamps, and jars of linseed oil. She stopped beside a heavy, aromatic cedar chest that had belonged to his grandfather, unlocked the brass latch, and reached deep beneath a stack of folded wool blankets. She lifted out a heavy, dark mahogany case wrapped in thick green felt. Clara set the case on her long woodworking bench and unclasped the twin steel locks. Inside lay two things. The first was a massive hand-engraved brass master drafting plate, 16 inches across, heavy enough to dent hardwood, deeply acid-etched with Arthur's original 25-year-old stress distribution equations and stamped with the raised red seals of the founding state infrastructure regulators. The second was a hand-bound leather ledger containing the original, notarized master trust charter of the Vance Heritage Trust, establishing 65% absolute controlling ownership of Aegis Infrastructure Group. These were not digital files stored on a server that Hayes could wipe or alter with administrative password. They were physical, unalterable bedrock, forged and sealed before Sterling Hayes or Evelyn Vance had ever heard the name Aegis. Clara picked up the heavy brass plate, feeling its weight in her callous hands, and handed it directly to her son. She looked him dead in the eye with the calm, absolute authority of a mother who had spent 15 years sanding oak in a damp basement to pay for his dream. "A tree with deep roots doesn't ask the weather for permission to stand, Arthur," she said, her voice resonant and unwavering. "You've let these people treat your silence like weakness long enough. Go show them who laid the foundation." The corporate boardroom on the 42nd floor of Aegis Tower was constructed entirely of reinforced glass and brushed steel. A modern temple design project absolute, unquestioned power. At 11 o'clock on Friday morning, 30 board members, major equity partners, and corporate attorneys sat around the 40-foot mahogany conference table. At the head of the room stood Sterling Hayes, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his expression glowing with supreme, premature victory. Standing proudly at his right hand was Evelyn Vance, dressed in a sharp ivory silk suit, a folder containing her incoming vice president and managing partner contract clutched tightly against her chest. Hayes tapped his gold pen against the crystal water glass, bringing the murmuring room to order. He announced that due to recent structural liabilities and emergency audit findings within the Bridge Maintenance Division, an immediate liquidation vote was required to sell the division to Apex Holdings. He raised his hand, preparing to call for the final board sign-off that would seal his $45 million theft and strip the company clean. Evelyn stepped forward, adjusting the microphone, ready to deliver her prepared remarks, framing the sale as a bold leap into modern corporate efficiency. Just as Hayes raised his gavel to call for the vote, the heavy double oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a resounding thud. The room froze. Walking down the center aisle was Arthur Vance. He wore the same elbow-patch tweed jacket he had worn to the gala, his expression completely devoid of panic or anger. Flanking his left was Aegis's veteran chief legal counsel, Margaret Holt, carrying a thick leather portfolio. Flanking his right were 3 dark-suited special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Corporate Fraud Division. A sharp ripple of disbelief ran through the board. Evelyn's face instantly twisted in disgust. She took 2 steps forward, pointing a finger at her husband, her voice shrill and commanding. She demanded to know how security had allowed a disgraced, low-level technical contractor who was currently under criminal investigation to breach a closed board meeting. Hayes let out a short, bark-like laugh, resting his hands on the mahogany table. He looked down his nose at Arthur, mocking him openly, telling him that his little domestic drama at the gala had officially cost him his sanity, reminding him that a freelance staffer had 0 standing, 0 votes, and 0 business in an executive boardroom. He ordered security to drag Arthur out of the building immediately. Security didn't move an inch. Margaret Holt stepped forward, her calm, measured voice cutting through the rising tension like a razor. She informed Hayes that any attempt to touch or remove the man standing beside her would result in immediate, personal federal obstruction charges, for every board member involved. Arthur walked calmly to the head of the table, stopping directly opposite Hayes and Evelyn. Without saying a word, he unbuckled his scuffed satchel, reached inside, and lifted out the heavy green felt mahogany case. He unclasped the twin steel locks and pulled out the 16-inch, hand-engraved brass master drafting plate, along with the original notarized master trust charter. He set them down on the mahogany table with a heavy, metallic thump that vibrated through the glass walls. Margaret Holt adjusted her glasses and addressed the silent, stunned room. For the past 15 years, this board has operated under the assumption that the Vance Heritage Trust was an independent investment vehicle, Margaret stated, her voice carrying absolute authority. Today, we present the original, unalterable foundational charter from 25 years ago, a physical instrument embedded directly into the company's state regulatory filing before this firm was ever publicly registered. The Vance Heritage Trust holds 65% of the absolute, irrevocable controlling equity of Aegis Infrastructure Group, and the sole trustee, founder, and majority owner standing before you is Arthur Vance. The room completely exploded into chaotic noise. Board members gasped, leaping to their feet to stare at the heavy brass plate engraved with Arthur's founding algorithms. Evelyn turned entirely pale, her jaw dropping open, the breath leaving her lungs in a sickening gasp as she looked from the brass plate back to the husband she had treated like a low-level failure. Sterling Hayes stood frozen, his confident smirk vanishing instantly, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror as he realized he wasn't standing across from a weak contractor. He was standing in the shadow of the man who owned the very air he was breathing. The silence that followed Margaret Holt's announcement was deafening, heavy with the realization that the hierarchy of the entire multi-billion-dollar enterprise had just been inverted in a matter of seconds. Before Sterling Hayes could even attempt to craft a response or call his personal attorneys, the three federal agents stepped forward, their leather ID wallets flicking open to reveal federal credentials. The lead agent produced a signed federal arrest warrant and set it directly over the Apex Holdings liquidation proposal on the mahogany table. He read the charges aloud in a flat, clinical voice that echoed off the glass walls: multi-state wire fraud, corporate asset stripping, falsification of regulatory compliance documents, and federal infrastructure sabotage. Two agents moved behind Hayes, pinning his arms behind his back and snapping cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The arrogant, polished SOO who had spent a decade treating people like disposable commodities completely collapsed. His face flushed a dark, terrified red, sweat breaking out across his forehead as he stammered incoherent excuses, begging his personal attorney across the table to stop them. He was escorted down the central aisle of the boardroom, his boots dragging awkwardly against the carpet, a pathetic, broken figure stripped of every shred of unearned authority. Evelyn stood entirely frozen, her ivory silk suit suddenly looking like a costume from a play that had ended mid-scene. Her hands trembled so violently that the folder containing her prospective executive promotion slipped from her fingers, scattering papers across the polished floor. The full, crushing weight of reality hit her all at once. The husband she had treated as a humiliating liability, the quiet man in the tweed jacket she had mocked, dismissed, and locked out her home, was the sole controlling titan behind the entire company. As the federal agents cleared the doorway, Evelyn took a hesitant, desperate step toward Arthur. Her voice, usually so sharp, rehearsed, and commanding, cracked into a high, frantic plea. She reached out toward his arm, her eyes wide with terror, claiming she had been manipulated by Hayes all along. She begged Arthur to listen to her, insisting that she was a victim of Hayes' scheme, swearing that everything she had done was just corporate posturing and that she still loved him, pleading for a private moment to explain and rebuild their life. Arthur didn't flinch, nor did he step back. He simply looked at her with a quiet, icy detachment that was far more devastating than any shouted insult could ever be. He reached into his satchel one last time and pulled out two sets of documents. The first was the prenuptial agreement Evelyn had forced him to sign 3 years ago to protect her corporate bonuses, the very document she had gloated about in her handwritten sticky note just 2 days prior. The second was a forensic audit packet detailing her personal electronic signatures on the Apex Holdings compliance waivers, along with a draft contract guaranteeing her a 6% equity stake in Hayes' fraudulent shell company. Arthur slid both documents across a mahogany table until they rested directly in front of her. "You built your entire life on appearances, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice quiet, steady, and utterly final. "You judged my mother by the clothes she wore, and you judged me by the car I drove. You were so busy looking at the surface that you never bothered to ask what held the floor beneath your feet together. Now you get to see how thin the ice really was." He turned to Margaret Holt and gave a single, quiet nod. Margaret immediately presented Evelyn with a formal notice of immediate termination for cause, backed by the board's emergency executive authority. Along with the litigation, Holt notice freezing all her company-issued accounts for federal prosecution. Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Stripped of her title, her career, her social status, and facing potential criminal liability alongside Hayes, she stood alone in the center of the boardroom, utterly disgraced, completely undone, and left with nothing. 6 months after the storm swept through Aegis infrastructure, the air on a crisp October morning smelled clean and fresh above the river. The company had been thoroughly restored under David Van Sterling's steady leadership, its core divisions protected, its rogue executives replaced, and its thousands of employees secure in their careers. But on this particular autumn morning, the focus was not on corporate boardrooms or stock valuations. It was centered on the banks of the river, where a massive, newly constructed suspension bridge spanned the water, a masterpiece of modern civil engineering, designed using Arthur Vance's perfected stress distribution algorithms. Hundreds of people had gathered along the river walk for the dedication ceremony. Local residents, construction crews in hard hats, engineers, and young students from nearby universities. Standing at the center of the ribbon-cutting platform, surrounded by civic leaders and press cameras, was Clara Vance. She wore a simple, elegant slate-gray dress, her silver hair catching the morning sunlight, her posture as proud and unbending as ever. In her hands, she held a silver pair of antique tailoring shears, the very shears she'd used decades ago in her damp basement to restore furniture and mend clothes to pay for her son's education. Arthur stood half a step behind her, wearing his familiar tweed jacket, a quiet, contented smile on his face. He had officially stepped down from all corporate titles, transferring his controlling interest into an independent oversight board and establishing a $100 million fund, the Clara Vance Foundation. The initiative was designed to provide full-tuition civil engineering scholarships, emergency family assistance, and community restoration grants to working-class families across 10 states, ensuring that young men and women from humble backgrounds would never have to trade their dignity for an education. When the mayor invited Clara to speak, the crowd went completely still. She stepped up to the microphone, looked out over the vast steel structure stretching across the horizon, and then turned her eyes to her son. "My son didn't become a good man because he built a company," she said, her voice clear, resonant, and carrying effortlessly across the river. "Plenty of people build things. What's hard is staying true to the soil you grew from after the world offers you prestige. Real strength doesn't shout. It doesn't wear a price tag, and it never steps on another human being to feel tall. Real strength is what holds up when everything else gives way." She brought the silver shears together, cutting the wide red ribbon to a roaring ovation from the crowd. As the applause echoed across the water, Arthur looked up at the towering steel girders anchoring the bridge to the solid rock beneath the riverbed. He thought about everything his family had survived, the long nights in the damp basement, the quiet sacrifices, the cruel arrogance of people who measure human worth by surface appearances, and the ultimate triumph of unshakable integrity. He realized then that true power has nothing to do with executive corner offices, expensive suits, or belittling others to feel important. True power is quiet. It is forged in sacrifice, maintained through honesty, and anchored in deep, unbreakable roots that no storm can ever tear away. If this story reminded you of the quiet strength in your own life, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder that real integrity always outlasts surface judgment. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deeply moving journey, and I'll see you in the next story.